So let's start with the basics. What exactly makes a company a monopoly? The simple answer is that a monopoly happens when a single company becomes the only real player in a market or industry with basically no competition to keep them in check. In legal terms, though, it's a bit more complicated. A firm needs to have what's called a significant and durable market power, which basically means that they can set the prices without facing major consequences and they can keep other companies from competing effectively. Here's where the numbers get important. Courts typically aren't too concerned about market dominance unless a company controls at least 50% of the sales in its market within a specific geographic area. But if a company has over 70% market share, they're pretty clearly viewed as having monopoly power. The tricky part is the gray zone between 50 to 70%, where regulators and courts are trying to figure out if what's happening is actually illegal or just a company being really good at what it does. The key thing to understand is that size alone doesn't make something a monopoly. A small business in a small market could technically have monopoly power if there's no real competition. What matters is whether that company can control prices and keep competitors out. So, companies can slide into monopoly territory through a bunch of different paths, and not all of them are shady. Let's break down the main ways this happens. Government granted monopolies are probably the most straightforward. Sometimes the government actually grants exclusive rights to a company to be the sole provider of something. This might sound weird, but it was historically common. Like when the English government gave the East India Company exclusive rights to import goods from India back in 1600. Today, these government monopolies are usually in industries like utilities where it makes sense to have one provider. The idea is that having just one water company or one electrical grid operator is actually more efficient for consumers than having multiple companies duplicating expensive infrastructure. These are called natural monopolies, and they typically have really high fixed costs that make competition just completely impractical. Buying up the competition is probably the most common way companies gain monopoly power today. When a company just buys all of its competitors instead of beating them in the market, that's how you get consolidation and monopolies. The government has a whole system to try to prevent this through merger reviews, but not always successfully. For example, the FTC blocked the proposed merger between Cisco and US Foods because bringing the two largest food distributors together would have created a company so dominant it would basically be a monopoly. Control of resources can also create monopolies. If a company controls access to something essential that everyone needs, like oil, water, or rare minerals, they've got a pretty easy path to monopoly status. Nobody else can really compete if you own the only source of what they need to make their product. Patents and intellectual property are another huge one. When a company develops something new and gets patent protection, they technically have a monopoly on that product for a certain period of time. This is actually intentional. The Constitution specifically empowers Congress to protect patents and copyrights to encourage innovation. The idea is that without knowing they'll have exclusive rights to their invention, companies wouldn't invest as much in research and development. Predatory practices are the sketchy ways companies build monopolies. This includes things like predatory pricing, where a company charges artificially low prices specifically to drive competitors out of their business. It's illegal, but it's hard to prove because you have to show intent to harm competition. Companies might also use exclusive contracts where they force other businesses to only work with them and nobody else. And this is where things get interesting, because not everyone agrees that monopolies are the enemy. There's actually a solid argument that monopolies can be pretty beneficial in certain situations. So, the case for monopolies. One major advantage of monopolies is something called economies of scale. When you're the only player in a market, you can produce on a massive scale, which means your average cost per unit drops significantly. Those savings can theoretically be passed down on to consumers, meaning that you get lower prices, which is especially true in industries with huge upfront costs, like building out a water distribution system or an electrical grid. If you had 5 different companies all trying to build separate water systems to the same neighborhood, that would be incredibly wasteful and expensive. One monopoly doing it once makes way more economic sense. There's also the innovation argument. People sometimes think monopolies don't innovate because they don't have to compete, but that's not always true. Companies like Google and Apple have significant market power, and they still invest heavily in research and development. The monopoly profits actually give them the resources to fund innovation. Plus, the patent system essentially creates temporary monopolies specifically to encourage companies to invest in new technology. Without that protection, why would a drug company spend billions developing a new medicine if a competitor could just copy it right away? Some economists also argue that firms with monopoly power are often there because they're the best. Google has a huge market power in search, but is that because Google is doing something wrong, or because Google is generally better than everyone else? If a company becomes dominant through superior products and services, is that really something that we should punish? There's also the network effects argument. Some services like social media platforms or public infrastructure are actually more valuable when they're unified under one singular provider. Imagine if different parts of the internet couldn't communicate with each other. The whole thing would just be broken. One unified network is more efficient. Okay, so here's why most economists and policymakers still think monopolies are problematic even when you consider those. When you have a monopoly, the company can charge whatever price they want because customers don't have alternatives. This is literally the definition of what makes a monopoly powerful. Even though monopolies can have lower costs due to economies of scale, there's no guarantee they'll pass that saving on to consumers. They're more likely to just pocket those profits. Monopolies also kill consumer choice. If there's only one company providing your internet and that company makes a terrible product, too bad, you're stuck. Consumers benefit from having options, and a monopoly means no options. There's also the concern about barriers to entry. Once a monopoly is established, it becomes almost impossible for new competitors to enter the market, whether through control of resources, patents, or just having so much money they can undercut any new entrant. Monopolies just protect their position. This prevents new, innovative companies from coming in and challenging the status quo. Alright, finally, monopolies can lead to higher prices and lower quality. Without competition breathing down their neck, there's no pressure to keep improving or keep costs reasonable. The company might not be doing anything explicitly illegal, but consumers still suffer. Alright, this is where it gets complicated. Let's say we accept that monopolies can be bad for consumers, but the question becomes, is the cure worse than the disease? So, antitrust enforcement. The government cracking down on monopolies can actually be pretty problematic itself. When the government gets too aggressive in breaking up companies or blocking mergers, it can actually slow down the innovation and hurt consumers in ways we don't always see. Here's the thing. If you're running a company and you're terrified that being too successful will get you broken up or fined, you might decide not to invest in as much innovation or expansion, because why take the risk? This kind of regulatory uncertainty can be really damaging to economic growth. There's also the issue of enforcement bias. Antitrust can become a political tool rather than a genuine protection of competition. When enforcement decisions start being made based on politics rather than economic principles, companies that the government likes get favored, and ones that don't get punished. This is actually a real concern that's been raised about recent antitrust decisions. Some people argue that they're being weaponized for political reasons rather than to protect consumers. Additionally, defining what counts as anti-competitive behavior is super hard. When does aggressive competition become predatory pricing? When does being good at your job become unfair market dominance? Courts and regulators sometimes disagree on these questions, and that uncertainty makes it hard for companies to operate. Maybe some companies would invest more and serve consumers better if they didn't have to worry about getting sued for being successful. Given all of these competing considerations, here's what governments actually try to do to prevent monopolies from forming in the first place. Merger review is probably the main tool. The US Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission review large company mergers and can block them if they think the combination would harm competition. This is like a checkpoint. If two companies are too big together, regulators say no. The idea is that preventing monopolies before they form is cleaner than trying to break them up after. Antitrust laws like the Sherman Act and Clayton Act prohibit certain practices. Companies can't collude with competitors to fix prices or divide up markets. They can't use their dominant position to unfairly crush competitors. For example, Microsoft got in trouble for using its dominance in operating systems to try to take over the internet browser market. It's legal to be dominant, it's not legal to abuse that dominance. Patents and intellectual property protection are deliberately maintained but limited. The system tries to balance the need for innovation by protecting new ideas against the need for competition by making those protections temporary. Once your patent expires, competitors can come in. This encourages innovation without creating permanent monopolies. Regulation of natural monopolies is also important. For utilities and other services where competition genuinely doesn't make sense, governments often allow the monopoly but regulate their prices to protect consumers. This way, you get the efficiency benefits of a single provider without the company being able to charge whatever they want. Antitrust enforcement against existing monopolies is also part of the toolkit. If a company is using illegal practices to maintain dominance, the government can prosecute them and even break them up. The famous example is Microsoft, which faced antitrust action for trying to extend its operating system dominance into other areas. In reality, monopoly prevention isn't perfect. Some monopolies are hard to prevent because they're genuinely natural, and you can't prevent one company from being the most efficient provider when the economics just don't work out that way. Some monopolies form slowly through legitimate business success, making it hard to point to the moment they became problematic. There's also a real question about whether the cure is proportional to the disease. If aggressive antitrust enforcement prevents some beneficial mergers and companies reduce innovation because they're afraid of getting broken up, maybe we've actually made consumers worse off. That doesn't mean we shouldn't prevent monopolies. Most economists think we should, but it means we need to be thoughtful about how we do it. The current approach tries to thread this needle by being selective about enforcement, blocking mergers that would clearly harm consumers, prosecute companies that use unfair practices, but don't just break them up for being successful, and it's an imperfect balance, but it's probably the best we can do when dealing with something as complicated as competition policy. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this type of video, and only if you like this type of video, please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching and have a good day.